Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Elisabeth Braw. I'm a resident fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and we're absolutely thrilled to be hosting an event on the Joint Expeditionary Force today. For those who haven't studied the Joint Expeditionary Force in detail, it's a fantastic group of now 10 countries as of this spring in the northern part of Europe, who have teamed up to form a UK-led force that can deploy when these countries decide it should deploy, either in support of NATO or in support of the United Nations, or on its own in a number of scenarios or crises, ranging from gray zone conflicts or subthreshold conflicts to humanitarian assistance to combat operations. And so it's fantastic to be able to welcome this morning James Heappey, the UK Minister for the Armed Forces, who will be speaking first. And as I was looking at the duties that Minister Hippie has as Armed Forces Minister, he really has the best part of the UK Minister of Defence, I have to say, and maybe that's a reward for having served in the Armed Forces himself, I don't know, but he did serve in the British Army, including in Iraq and in Afghanistan twice, and also in Northern Ireland. He then became an MP, was elected an MP in 2016, and this is his second ministerial post. And let me just give you an idea of what he gets to do, or what he has to do, depending on your perspective, as Armed Forces Minister. He is in charge of operations, Brexit, no deal planning, fourth generation, military recruitment and retention, cyber, international defense engagement, youth and cadets, and commemorations. So with that, over to you, Minister. And to everybody else, please remember to submit your questions so that we can get to as many as possible in the 15 minutes that we have after Minister Hippie's presentation. Over to you, Minister.
Elisabeth, thank you very much indeed. I thought for one horrible moment when you said that you pulled out a page and said, here's what the Minister does, you're about to go through my travel arrangements over the last year or so, because the greatest privilege of this job is going out and visiting our nation's armed forces wherever they're operating around the world, and in so doing, getting to meet so many of the armed forces with whom we're operating. And there are many in the audience today who I've had the opportunity to see their troops at work alongside the UK Armed Forces since I became a minister, and actually many more in the audience with whose armed forces I served during my own time in the army in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Can I start, however, by thanking you, Elisabeth, for your work alongside your colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute for arranging today's event, and to all of the panelists who have agreed to contribute. I'm looking forward to some wide-ranging discussion on how we pursue our shared interests, how we grow the role and capacity of the JEF, and what the future threats might be that we will all face together. It's also particularly exciting to be joined by the JEF's newest member, Iceland. You're very welcome. Now, my job this afternoon, or this morning, for those of you watching on the other side of the pond, is to set the scene for the discussions to come by attempting to put the Joint Expeditionary Force into context. And I want to do that by picking up on three shared qualities that I would argue define us as a group of nations: our shared geography, our shared values, and our shared willingness to stand up for the things we believe in, a shared sense of purpose. Our geography, of course, is the most obvious thing that we share. Up here on both Europe and NATO's northern flank, the threat from Russia feels just as real as it does for our friends and partners in the Black Sea. Russian naval and air activity is common and increasingly high tempo, whilst for our colleagues in the Baltic, Russian land forces sit in very close proximity. So I'm sure I won't have been the only defence minister to have seen the speed of the build-up of Russian armed forces in the Black Sea, and to ask myself how easily and how quickly that could have been achieved in the Baltic or in the north of Europe. More importantly, how would we have responded? My sense is that our normal force generation cycles aren't quick enough, and that in any case, even if they were, anything you add to the mix once the Russian build-up begins is quickly labelled as escalatory by the Kremlin and used to justify further aggravation on their part. Deterrence is therefore key. In our own integrated operating concept and in the Chief of the Defence Staff's in our own integrated review and in the Chief of the Defence Staff's integrated operating concept that sits alongside it, we've recognised that speed of response now matters more than mass. But if you're to avoid the fait accompli strategy that the Kremlin has employed elsewhere, there's a requirement for persistent engagement or constant competition as well. Some of how we do that is through NATO, like the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Estonia, the forthcoming BOLTOPS exercise in the Baltic, and our ongoing air policing commitments in Lithuania. But as we saw on our recent joint maritime activity in the Baltic, Expo as it was called, we can do it through the JEF too, showing readiness, capability and interoperability as a community of nations to deter aggression from wherever it might come. We also work together seamlessly and regularly to track Russian ships, submarines and planes as they move through our respective areas of interest. So working together as a team is nothing new. We've been doing it for decades and we do it very well. Forward presence in Northern Europe is an important part of the way that we'll operate over the decades to come. Much of the British Army's warfighting inventory will be forward-based in Germany, and our amphibious forces will reconstitute as a littoral response group at high readiness to operate in concert with our allies in Scandinavia, the Baltic and the High North. Indeed, the LRG is currently off the Norwegian coast exercising with our friends and allies as I speak. I know we're not alone in reaching this conclusion and that forward presence and speed of response are priorities shared by many of our allies as well. I think there's an exciting opportunity for the JEF to explore how, within this framework, we can develop those concepts further. Our shared geography as maritime nations brings with it less conventional threats as well. Our undersea cables are essential to our modern life and our digital economy. They carry more than 90% of the world's communications and financial transactions worth trillions of dollars every day. Likewise, subsea energy interconnectors are proving essential in balancing fluctuations of renewable energy loads across our energy systems, a key part of our collective efforts to decarbonise. This hasn't gone unnoticed by our adversaries, who now seek to hold that critical subsea infrastructure at risk. So we need to collectively consider how we can defend them. This is why we've announced that we'll acquire a new multi-role ocean surveillance ship fitted with advanced sensors and carrying undersea drones for collecting data. It will help protect our deep-sea interests and deter our adversaries from meddling with them. As a threat that we share, and I think Norway is intending to build a motorway under the sea, we look forward to working with JEF partners to explore what other capabilities are required and how we can work together to ensure that that shared critical national infrastructure is not challenged by our adversaries. Finally, our shared geography brings a shared concern for the High North. Climate change and a reduction in sea ice is making the Northern Sea route increasingly viable as a commercial shipping lane. The opportunity to reduce shipping distance from China to Europe by around 40% compared to transiting Suez will bring increased competition to the region, and with that competition comes increasing risk of states looking to militarise and monopolise international water. Russia, in particular, is taking an increasingly militarised approach, reopening Cold War-era bases above the Arctic Circle, investing further in Arctic-capable equipment, and establishing a new Northern Joint Strategic Command. No doubt, the complexity of both the politics and the security situation in the High North will be exacerbated further by growing Chinese interest in the region as they seek to secure their sea lines of communication to European and North American markets. We're in the throes of developing the UK's High North strategy, and our conversation with JEF partners will be key in making sure that as a community of nations, we have a mutual understanding of the challenges and the possible solutions in this increasingly competitive and strategically important region. Our shared geography would seem, at first glance, to be the most obvious thing that we all have in common. But actually the idea of the JEF, I'm led to believe, was actually born from the shared values we stood up for together in Afghanistan. We are a community of Northern European nations who believe in democracy and in freedom. We stand for freedom of speech and freedom of expression. We know how to disagree with each other without resorting to confrontation. And we value friendship. More than any military mass, it's those values and the friendship they underpin that outmatches our adversaries. And that's why, I would argue, our adversaries are increasingly keen on targeting the cohesion of our friendship internationally and the free running of our democracies at home. Last year, while the pandemic raged, so too did state-sponsored disinformation. The Rapid Response Unit in the UK's Cabinet Office, charged with dealing with these lies, found itself handling about 70 instances of false information every week. Some of it was just people getting the wrong end of the stick, but much of it was a deliberate attempt to fan conspiracy theories and to erode the trust in the civil authorities. We've also been clear that Russia has tried to undermine our democracy by meddling here in elections in the UK. And we know that they've been using exactly the same techniques to undermine democracies elsewhere in Europe and in the wider world. 2020 was also the year in which the National Cybersecurity Centre dealt with 723 major incidents alongside the tens of thousands of minor ones, the highest figure since the centre was formed 5 years ago. A reflection of how, again, there is a constant threat to our data, the intellectual property of our companies, our state secrets, and our personal privacy. The United Kingdom has established 77th Brigade to lead on information manoeuvre, an increasingly important front in the subthreshold competition that defines our age. And we've just launched the National Cyber Force, which will be a key part in developing both our offensive and defensive cyber capabilities. With all these, we share subthreshold threats, and we're all similarly seized by how we'll tackle them both as standalone grey zone activities and also as integral parts to any modern crisis, whether that's military, civil, or a natural disaster. That's why next month, defence ministers from all JEF nations will conduct a tabletop exercise in Helsinki in order to enhance our crisis management coordination across all domains. Later in the year, in September, we'll also be conducting exercise Joint Protector, a 2-star command post exercise involving all 10 JEF nations and almost 500 troops. It will prove the JEF's ability to operate in a sub-threshold role and provide protection against malign influence on us all. The JEF's activity in the hybrid space this year is a reminder that we're not just a Russian-facing military grouping, and we're certainly not an alternative to NATO. We are a group of like-minded nations that bring different yet complementary skills to the table. We are agile and flexible and determined. We get things done. We don't need to get the permission of every nation before deploying, and we don't all have to participate when we do. Just a couple of nations acting in concert can operate under the JEF flag, enabling us to respond quickly, be proactive, and deal with a greater diversity of issues. Our shared sense of purpose means we refuse to be passengers when it comes to security in our neighbourhood. The US wants Europe to take more responsibility for its security, and we all agree. We all value our relationship with the states enormously, but through the JEF, we're showing our willingness to stand up for ourselves. The UK has invested heavily in our ability to act as a framework nation with our new aircraft carriers and our continued investment in both a fully deployable fighting division and the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps headquarters. But we've no monopoly on expertise nor leadership. We see the JEF as a partnership in which we can learn a great deal. Within this team is expertise on operating in the high north, operating in electronically denied environments, operating in high mountains, and operating in the depth of the oceans. We all have slightly different politics, we perceive the threat slightly differently, and we have slightly different ways of seeing the world. But that's what makes this partnership so special, because there's a diversity of thought, but a singularity of purpose. So I want to finish by reflecting on the words of Commodore James Parkin, who in 2019 led Baltic Protector, the largest UK-led operational deployment of a military force in Europe for decades. He summed up the JEF's utility when he said, It's a force of friends, filling a hole in the security architecture of Northern Europe between a national force and a NATO force. We are equipped, fueled, and armed to go on any operation. Well, I don't think I could have put it better myself. We recognise the importance of NATO. No one seeks to detract from that. And we recognise the commitment of the United States to European security. We're very grateful for both. But the JEF neither replaces nor competes with those. We have a shared geography, we have a shared set of values, and we have a shared sense of purpose. Those, I think, are the ideal building blocks for a grouping that feels ever more relevant as the century ticks on. The JEF is indeed an important European asset, but I get the sense it has enormous utility far wider, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it develops over the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. It feels like the JEF will soon be on its way to all manner of conflicts and crisis situations, because there are so many where it's not clear who should get involved and where really nobody is getting involved. And so you've mentioned several times threats below the threshold of armed conflict, what some of us call gray zone, and you also mentioned speed of response. So can you give us an idea of what it would look like, and especially because the JEF is a body that operates by consensus. Nobody can tell anybody else what to do. So what would it look like if, say, the undersea cables that you mentioned were sabotaged by a group or country? How would the JEF be able to get involved, intervene, and how quickly would that happen?
Well, I mean, I think, Elisabeth, that you seize on what I see as two slightly separate issues. The first is, how do we as a group of nations, and indeed individually in our sovereign decision-making, react to sub-threshold activity that in and of itself very rarely moves the dial, but cumulatively over time becomes very malign and has quite profound effect on your ability to operate and on your calculations as a nation. And I think that what is required there is a robustness in approach that calls out interference when it is seen, when other nations are seeking to hold critical national infrastructure at risk. We shouldn't be shy in saying that that's the case. When hostile nations are trying to steal our secrets or invade the privacy of our citizens or to influence our democratic processes, we should call that out too, because there is just behaviour that needs to exist within the international community, and norms that need to be established that we expect all nations to live by. So that collective determination to stand up for our values and to not tolerate the constant sub-threshold activity that cumulatively becomes so much more is prime in that sense. But when it does come to military response, I think that what matters in our estimation is not the fact that you've got tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of troops in their barracks sort of just waiting for a war for which they have 6 months or 12 months notice. Actually, what you need is a presence that is forward in the strategically important areas that deters the opportunism that I think we've seen from the Kremlin too much over the last decade and a half. And I think, if we can change their calculation around where there is opportunity through our own forward presence, and if we work with our friends and allies to make sure that that is a meaningful forward presence, that will change the dynamic in that sense. And then when there is the first sign of trouble, if you leave it so long that the force build-ups on the other side have already got to a point where everything becomes an escalatory process, it's too late. So actually having stuff at readiness that can get there quickly at the first sign of trouble to deter the force build-ups from ever happening in the first place, again, feels hugely important. Now, that is so much more easily said than done. But that really underpins the deduction that we've made in the integrated review that, yes, warfighting mass still matters, of course it does. But what matters far more is our ability to get somewhere and operate quickly so that we can remain upstream of trouble.
Yes, and that's, of course, the nature of deterrence. It's about signaling in the first place, and only if the signaling fails do you have to physically move men and women and equipment. So one other aspect that you mentioned that is so fundamentally important when it comes to the JEF is that it involves NATO member states and non-NATO member states. So it's, again, 10 countries, the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, and the UK and the Netherlands. So a mix. And Europe has been told so many times that it should do more for its own security. This group is doing more for its own security and for the wider for the security of Europe more widely and perhaps globally as well. But as soon as you do something outside NATO, that then becomes almost a competition with NATO. How do you square that that circle of wanting to do more for European security without competing with NATO?
Well, I don't see it as a competition. I really don't. If I look around the wider Euro-Atlantic neighbourhood, I see that on NATO's southern flank there is an enormous international effort that many JEF countries are involved in the Sahel, but that is a French-led coalition fighting violent extremism there. I see an appetite for a mid-Atlantic group of nations that includes Morocco, Brazil, the Caribbean, the US, as well as Portugal, Spain, France, the UK, Ireland, some of which are NATO countries, some aren't, but they recognise the shared concern for counter-narcotics, organised crime, as well as conventional military threats in the Atlantic. And in the High North and in Scandinavia and in the Baltic, I see the same. I see a group of nations who have a shared concern for that neighbourhood, some of which are in NATO, some of which aren't. So it just feels to me as if the alliance remains completely relevant. NATO is the absolute bedrock of European security, but it is not the answer to all questions that we face within the neighbourhood. And so actually these groupings that are, yes, built on NATO countries, but then embrace the interests of others in the neighbourhood in order to tackle issues on our sort of southern, western and northern flanks feels enormously relevant. And I just don't see how they're competing with each other. In fact, I regard them as entirely complementary.
Yes, and I think it's likely we'll see more groups like this of countries in a particular region that choose to team up in this maybe less formal or institutional structure than is the case with NATO, and that is complementary. Just a reminder to everybody to submit your questions. They are already coming in, and I'll get to as many as I can. The first one is, with the increase of military activity in Northern Europe, including the High North and the Arctic, which is an area, a region that you already addressed, Minister, the risk of military incidents may increase. How can the JEF contribute to develop a risk management process in parallel to develop interoperability and deployability?
Well, I think that this is where our collective understanding of the problem will be most advantageous, because I think that the UK has a view. We sit as an island in strategic waters that the Russian Northern Fleet passes on its way into the Atlantic, and that frames our view of the challenge. But other countries share land borders with who they regard as their principal adversary, and that brings with it a very different set of calculations around how they should operate. That shared expertise and difference of approach, different perceptions of the threat, I think is actually an enormous strength. And that's why I was at pains to say that I just reject any notion that the JEF is a vehicle for UK leadership. We're proud to be within it. We're proud to have the assets that we've got. But fundamentally, this is a group of nations that kind of share the same challenges. And through seeking to understand them mutually and to kind of calibrate how things best work, I think we will come up with the best solutions. Now, in the High North, I think that's a particularly sensitive challenge because it will be increasingly an international sea route, and we should all stand up for all the rights of freedom of navigation that are so important on a sea route like that. But we need to do it in a way that isn't escalatory, isn't confrontational, just asserts that this is an international system within which these norms need to be respected. I think that there's, if there's a characteristic that we share in common more than any other, it's that I think we probably all fancy ourselves on being reasonably emotionally intelligent as countries in the way that we go about our international affairs. And I just have a feeling that that will lead us to some really good ideas about how we stand up for what is right in the High North without being unnecessarily provocative.
And if I may add, it's no mean feat to have gathered 10 countries, 10 like-minded countries within this format. That is quite innovative. And so congratulations to the JEF countries, I guess, is what I want to say. And I think we're all looking forward to seeing more of the JEF, which brings me to the next question. There are so many excellent questions coming in, but here a very practical one. At present, is the JEF limited to acting within the European/Arctic theatre?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, I think that we are, I think one of the other things that is a consequence of our shared values and our shared sense of purpose is I think we all share a desire to be a force for good in the world. Last summer I saw the UK and the Netherlands working together on humanitarian relief in the Caribbean following hurricanes there. I think it's entirely conceivable that as the JEF embeds in our collective psyche and we start to really explore what the opportunities are, not just militarily, but also in that sort of hybrid space that I discussed in my speech, we might also start to consider how we demonstrate our shared values through humanitarian response around the world as well. And I don't want to sort of make policy on the hoof, but it just feels like that's a value that we all share and therefore an opportunity to coordinate.
Absolutely. And well, I have to choose from the questions now, but please keep sending questions because there are so many excellent ones. Here's another practical one for you, Minister. The evolution of the JEF has basically taken it from a bottom-up military initiative with the intent of the participating nations to be expeditionary together wherever we needed to go, to a more regionally focused coalition with the ability to also include other security tools and military forces, also working subthreshold. That begs the question, should the name be changed to better reflect the intent of our cooperative partnership or efforts? I'm not asking you to give the JEF a new name here, but it has a wider mission today than just to be an expeditionary force. I guess that there is value to this question.
No, I think there's enormous value to the question because I think that the questioner is entirely right that the Joint Expeditionary Force paints a picture of a sort of force in waiting, ready to be deployed in response to a crisis that we all share an interest in resolving. And I think that what I've explored in my speech and in the answer to your question so far, Elisabeth, is a far broader utility. I think I would rather worry about the function of the JEF and let the form follow, and if a name change in due course were desirable, then fine. But what matters infinitely more to me is that we are completely free thinking in how this group of nations can evolve, what problems we think we can set ourselves to solving. Our shared geography naturally steers us towards a military role in the face of an obvious adversary. But there is just so much more that I think what we share and that we could do. And perhaps discussions on that should come ahead of discussions on the name change.
And it is a nifty name. When do you ever get an acronym that's easy to pronounce?
Yes.
Another point, a very valid point here is one of the often voiced criticisms of NATO is the slowness of its decision-making. How will the JEF ensure faster decision-making and build consensus?
Sorry, there's a whole load of buzzing going on. I don't know if it's a phone here or there or wherever else. Can you just ask the question again?
Yes. How can the JEF ensure faster decision making than NATO, which is often criticized for being slow in its decision making?
Well, I mean, I don't want to use today as a platform for criticising NATO, but implicit in what I said around speed of response ahead of mass and an acknowledgement of the requirement to operate sub-threshold and to deter through forward presence was an obvious exposure of the UK's belief that NATO might evolve over the next decade or so to be more relevant in facing the threats that we all now face. But I think that the advantage of the JEF, and I, as I've been at pains to point out, I don't think this is to sort of compensate for where NATO is at or to compete with where NATO is at. I just think it's an advantage of the way that the JEF has come into existence. The JEF doesn't need unanimity to operate. It is a grouping of convenience, and if 2, 3, 5 out of 10 nations see shared purpose in doing something under the JEF banner, then so we will. And that gives us the ability to operate quickly. And others can, of course, take their time in their political decision making and join the grouping thereafter. But I think there's something quite attractive if you buy into what we've deducted in our integrated review as being so important to counter the threats that exist in the modern world, speed of response, then you have to, I think, build structures that are less reliant on very deliberate and protracted political deliberations, and that's what the JEF does.
And so a less formal and perhaps more rapid form of decision making, and again based on the fact that this is a group of 10 like-minded countries with similar regional outlooks. Now, on the NATO note again, what is the key opportunity for NATO and JEF cooperation and mutual support?
Well, to be explored. I mean, I think that for those of us who are both NATO countries and JEF countries, inevitably the demand from NATO will be greatest and most frequent. I don't see that as a problem. I mean, a lot of our activity in the Baltic and in the High North is under the NATO banner and is entirely complementary with what we would want from the JEF. But I think that the JEF gives us the opportunity to fill in the gaps. It gives us the opportunity to be more persistent, which I think is key. NATO has to service activity on a broad front, doing stuff in the High North, doing stuff in Central Europe, doing stuff on the southern flank, and potentially thousands of miles beyond. So it makes sense to me that you look at the NATO drumbeat of activity as the bedrock, and then you discuss as a group of JEF nations what more the requirement is and what our collective appetite is to do that. And then that's what we do. And the maritime exercise 6 or 7 weeks ago is a great example of that. The exercises to come this summer will build on that further. And that's exactly how I sort of see it, an effort that is entirely complementary to what NATO does and that has an effect that builds on the deterrence that we all recognise as absolutely vital in this part of the world.
I have to insert a question of my own now. And actually, I just had a question from Ben Hodges, who I think all know that I will include later. But sorry, General Hodges, I'll go first myself because I've been dying to ask this question. The UK has just concluded its integrated review, which obviously includes foreign policy, security policy, and development. And it occurred to me as you were speaking that there is opportunity or there's scope for the JEF, considering that it's a group of includes a group of countries that also feel very strongly about development assistance, and I wonder if there is scope within the JEF to be of use to other countries in crisis, not just from the armed forces side, but in cooperation with the development side.
Well, I would hope so. I mean, I just goes back to that point about not just shared geography, but shared values. And, we are a generous bunch in this corner of the world. And that generosity is not without purpose. There is I think, a real value in showing your values around the world through the way that you do aid and development. In fact, doing so is absolutely critical to getting upstream of conflict that might challenge our security interests. So again, I mean, I don't want to, in the space of 45 minutes of a speech and Q&A, kind of broaden the JEF to an all-encompassing sort of UN light. But the reality is that where there is shared purpose, shared values, shared interest, one could see how a coordinated development and aid agenda might be valuable in achieving that. Certainly, if I in answer to one of your questions a few minutes ago, Elisabeth, I referenced the sort of complementary groupings that have grown on the southern flank and I think are emerging in the Atlantic. And it's absolutely the case that in the Sahel, where France and the UN are leading the international response to a crisis, there is a requirement not just to coordinate military effort, but to coordinate aid and development effort as well, because those of us who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I suspect anywhere else, have seen with our own eyes that you can throw all the military resource at a problem that you want, but if you don't back it up with the political and development effort that should go around it, then you're just going to get nowhere. And so it stands as self-evident to me, I think, that if we were involved in military activities, we would want to consider what the diplomatic and development wrap for those should be as well.
I applaud you for not being drawn into setting new policy in a Q&A, but we'll be watching this space to see how the JEF countries decide to hopefully agree that this is a good idea. Just one more question, because we only have 3 minutes left, and that is, what can the other nations do to best support the UK's role as a framework nation in the coming years? What more is needed? So a generous offer, it seems, from somebody from another JEF country.
Yes. So, I mean, I think what the CDS, Nick Carter, will be here very shortly to do is to talk about how the JEF could and should operate. And I think that that's one of the things that I might leave to him more than anything else. I mean, I think that the UK has clear intent and capacity to be a framework nation, but that doesn't mean that we are the only nation within the JEF that is capable of being so. And actually, the JEF is so much stronger if other nations have the ambition to be a framework nation around which JEF activity could cohere. So what I might do is do that sort of political thing of sloping shoulders onto the senior military and letting Nick pick that up in his session that follows. But I do think it's a really important point. I said it in my speech, and if the JEF were to ever be misunderstood as some sort of vehicle for UK leadership in the northwestern European neighbourhood, that would be a grotesque misrepresentation of how the JEF came together and how it is viewed in the Ministry of Defence. This is, we just don't have all of the environmental expertise that is needed to succeed in this part of the world. We don't have all of the expertise that is required to come up with the right solutions against those that challenge us. Collectively, we absolutely do. And that's the exciting opportunity, if we get this right, to listen to each other, to learn from one another. The UK may be the framework nation from time to time, but hopefully so will others. And that's, I think, what's most exciting about it all.
And the level of engagement or commitment to the JEF in the member states is evident, I think, in the next panel, which has two defense ministers and another chief of defense, in addition to Nick Carter, who I will put in the hot seat regarding that question. So it hasn't been forgotten. With that, thank you very much, Minister Heappey, who has, I think you have covered an enormous range of questions here, and you haven't set new policy. So you have, I think, made us all, those of us who weren't converts, JEF converts, I think, are JEF converts now. It is a really a very impressive group of countries. So thank you very much. And to all of you listening, please remain online for the next session, which starts in 5 minutes with General Carter. So thank you, Minister.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Good morning again, and good afternoon for those of you in Europe. My name is Elisabeth Braw, and I know we met just an hour ago, but for those of you joining now, it's a pleasure to meet you, and it's a particular pleasure to be joined by General Sir Nick Carter, who is, of course, the UK Chief of the Defence Staff. And I took the liberty to write down some key points in his career, simply because if I try to recite it from memory, I will miss something in his distinguished career. So let's just say it started at age 18, when I think most of us hadn't decided what to do with ourselves. That's when he joined the British Army. He then served as an infantry officer in Germany, in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, in Cyprus under the United Nations, and also in Bosnia, in Kosovo, then in Iraq, and several tours in Afghanistan. And I know there are several people on this call today who served under him in Afghanistan. General Sir Nick then led the British Army, and of course now leads the complete armed forces as Chief of the Defence Staff. So I would like to turn the floor over to General Carter now, and he will be joined immediately afterwards by Minister Hultqvist from Sweden, Minister Pabris from Latvia, General Herem from Estonia, and Congressman Turner. So with that, over to you, General, and for all of you, please remember to submit your questions early so that we have a chance to get to as many of them as possible.
No, Elisabeth, thank you very much for your introduction, and it's good to see you again. And I hasten to add, the reason I joined the Army at the age of 18 was because I hadn't got a clue what to do, so that's why we are where we are today. Anyway, we can look back in history in due course. I'd also like to put on the record how pleased I am that Iceland has joined the JEF recently. That brings our number up to 10, which I think is a really good place to be. Anyway, what I thought I would try and do this afternoon is to give a sense of how we see the global strategic context and some of the deductions that we might draw from that in relation to the JEF. And I think my starting point would be that I can't remember a time when that strategic context was more complex or dynamic. The defining condition, I think, seems to be one of instability. We have returned to an era of global competition, which I don't think we've seen in over 75 years. And this competition, I think, is overlaid with the threat from violent extremism, which is compounded by an increasing number of failing states, by climate change, by population growth, by migration, and of course what we've seen with the pandemic over the last 14 or 15 months. And of course we're also living through an era of profound change, driven by the rapid pace of technological development. Now, returning to the competition, our assertive authoritarian rivals, as I shall describe them, because it's not necessarily about enemies, they see the strategic context as a continuous struggle in which non-military and military instruments are used unconstrained by any distinction between peace and war. And I'll return to that a bit because it's so relevant to the way in which perhaps the JEF may operate in the future. Now, these regimes believe that they're already engaged in an intense form of conflict that is predominantly political rather than military. Their strategy of political warfare is designed to undermine cohesion, to erode economic, political and social resilience, and to compete for strategic advantage in key regions of the world. Their goal is to win without going to war, as we would define it. They want to achieve their objectives by breaking the willpower of their rivals, using attacks below the threshold of what would prompt a warfighting response. Now, I think these attacks on our democratic way of life from these authoritarian rivals, and of course the extremist ideologies I referred to earlier, are remarkably difficult to defeat, because in trying to defeat them, there is a risk that you will undermine the very freedoms that we want to protect. We are, to all intents and purposes, exposed through our very openness. And I think this is increasingly becoming a contest of ideologies. Now, the pervasiveness of information and rapid technological development have changed the character of warfare and indeed of politics. No longer is there a clear distinction between peace and war, between foreign and domestic policy, between state and non-state, and between virtual and reality. We now have new tools, techniques and tactics that can be used to undermine political and social cohesion and the means to make the connection to an audience ever more rapidly. Information is now effectively democratized. Now, our rivals are not frightened of reinforcing the message with their actions on others' sovereign territory, as we saw with the use of military-grade nerve agent in the attempted assassination of the Skripals on British soil in 2018. In Northern Europe, control of our airspace and our waters is also being tested on a monthly basis, with an ostentation that I don't think we've seen since the Cold War. And indeed, our rivals have studied our Western way of war. They've identified our vulnerabilities and they've modernised their capabilities to target them. It's not hard, given that the campaigns of the last 30 years have been played out over global media networks. They saw that air power could penetrate deep into hostile territory, and they learned that we preferred to find and strike targets from afar. They saw that this enhanced our natural aversion to putting people in harm's way, and they watched how casualties, financial cost, and length of time swayed domestic and international public opinion. So they learned to improve their own resilience to absorb strikes. They learned how to deny us the ability to bring our military power to bear. They developed air defence systems that deny our freedom of action. They improved their maritime undersea capabilities. They developed long-range missile systems. They integrated electronic warfare, swarms of drones, all connected digitally to missile systems, and used them to defeat armoured vehicles. They've invested in space and cyber, recognising the importance that, of course, we attach to global positioning and digitisation. They've used cyber and information attacks against their opponents regularly in the last few years. And, of course, the recent attack against US government systems is a very good and notable example. Proxies, mercenaries and militias are now back in fashion as well. The expansion of foreign mercenaries into security vacuums in parts of Africa, the Middle East and South Asia reveals how mercenaries can be used to support state and non-state partners, to extract resources, to influence foreign leaders, and to do so with plausible deniability, blurring the line between private and public interests. There seems to be a clear trend towards military action that uses information warfare and arm's-length instruments like drones and mercenaries, to provide a plausible degree of deniability and strategic ambiguity, thus enabling intervention, I think, without the risk of entanglement. This way of warfare is synchronised, it's systematic and it's strategic. But the stakes are high. The traditional diplomatic instruments that have provided some measure of arms control and counter-proliferation have all but disappeared. And politics have become more populist, more nationalist, and more bellicose. The upshot is that the threat of unwarranted escalation, and therefore miscalculation, is clear and present. So what deductions would I draw from this context that I have painted? I think the first observation is our response has to be equally strategic. Our rivals lack friends and allies. Hence the advantage of close partnership between like-minded partners. The JEF, I think, is a manageable size group of partners. Hence it's a tremendous forum for interoperability. And of course, interoperability we always think about simply as being about technology. But it's much more than that. Because if one examines the hierarchy of fighting power, the moral, the physical, and the conceptual sitting above it, it's about making sure you can interoperate in each of the elements of that hierarchy. It's essentially about people, it's about process, and it's about technology. And when I talk about process in military terms, of course, I talk about doctrine. And what we have to do is to make sure that we build on the very close human relationships that we've been developing since 2014. And that's why I hugely value our group of JEF Chods who get together twice a year and are able to talk thoroughly honestly about what it is that we need to achieve. Now, I think it's much easier on that basis for us, with the UK providing a clear framework nation opportunity for others, and amongst what I would describe as a sensible-sized group of like-minded militaries, to be able to achieve some form of interoperability. All of us, I think, share a common perspective on the geostrategic challenges we face. We do, of course, share the same values and beliefs in a free and open way of life, and we are all invested in the multilateral system that assures our security, our stability, and our prosperity. Second deduction I think I'd make is deterrence needs to be updated for rivals who seek to win without resorting to a hot war. We talk in our doctrine about deterrence being comprehension, capability, credibility, and communication. I think to that we now need to add a fifth C, that of competition. Because if we don't do that, there will be the risk of us being defeated in fait accompli strategies, as we've seen in the South China Sea, in Crimea, and it's not beyond the wit of man to perhaps see that Svalbard, for example, could be threatened in this way. And of course, the tactics of plausible deniability, the utilisation of people like little green men, proxies and mercenaries, all mean that we can't afford to create strategic vacuums that subsequently get filled in these fait accompli strategies. What's needed, I think, is a more nuanced posture, perhaps more agility and more adaptability, maybe more assertive. But of course, the response to poor or reckless seamanship might be a tug rather than a frigate. We don't need to be assertive. We don't need to be demonstrating our combat power all the time. The point about nuance is something that we should be thinking hard about. Now, we should also recognise that escalation management is much harder. We now have the new operational domains of cyber and space alongside air, land and maritime. Of course, with those ones, attribution is very challenging. And of course, there are new weapon systems that are blurring the distinction between conventional and nuclear war. So escalation management and how we play it and how we exercise it is pretty fundamental, I think, to our thinking. Next, I think we need to recognise that this all suggests we need a new strategic culture. A new strategic culture that is fit for an era of constant competition, something we haven't had for 75 years. The Cold War was a bipolar world in which it was relatively straightforward to understand what was happening. After that, we had, say, 20 to 30 years of a unipolar world where the greatest challenge was stabilisation, intervention, perhaps, and terrorism. We're now beyond that, and we're in a multipolar world where it's a multi-dimensional game of checkers that needs to be played. Now, of course, there's some questions to ask, therefore, about our escalation frameworks. And if you look at NATO's escalation framework, which talks about BACO, meaning baseline and current operations, then crisis, then conflict, where there are clear thresholds in which Article 5, for example, would be implemented. The question, though, is how do you create a continuum between BACO or competition through crisis to conflict? Because it's always going to be challenging to gain consensus amongst 30. And that, of course, I think is where the JEF offers opportunities to think laterally and differently about the way we might do this, because of our like-mindedness and our potential agility. This enables us, I think, to think much more clearly about the challenge of this continuum between competition, conflict, and crisis and conflict. And I think also it enables us with the opportunity, probably, to develop the strategic culture that I'm describing. Recognising, of course, that some of our members are obviously not members of NATO, we should recognise that the JEF is complementary to NATO. It is not an alternative. The next deduction I would draw is the importance of exercising some of this, because it's only by exercising it that we can understand how some of these scenarios might play out. And we all had good notice of this, I think, with the Russian escalation around Ukraine recently. So looking forward to the 30th of June and the 1st of July, when we have a ministerial tabletop exercise, that will be a tremendous opportunity to put on the table some scenarios that test our political parameters, that bring out some of the potential tensions in operating in this subthreshold world before crisis, but also to test our appetite, perhaps, for linking some of our actions with some of our words, so that we achieve an integrated effect on the audiences that are relevant to what we're trying to achieve. And then I think looking forward to September, when we have the Joint Protector Exercise 2021, which will be a CPX, a command post exercise, plus in Sweden, which again is a great opportunity to understand some of the dynamics associated with what might occur pre-crisis. The next deduction I would draw is the importance of integration. And of course, our recently published integrated review and the financial opportunity that comes with it from our defence perspective is a good example of this sort of thinking. Clearly, integration is about interoperability amongst allies in the context of the JEF, as I mentioned earlier. But it's also about integration across the new operational domains, so space, cyber, land, air, and maritime. Horizontally across those domains, but also vertically from the strategic through the operational to the tactical levels. Now, all of that in our doctrine will be enabled by a digital backbone, because it's the digital backbone that gives you the information advantage to make this integration achieve your operational effect. Now, to my mind, we should see the JEF as a laboratory for experimenting with this, but also for developing a digital backbone that can provide that commonality across like-minded allies. And this, of course, plays to how we conduct our acquisition in the future, because we're placing great emphasis in the UK on the relationship between experimentation, R&D, science and technology, and acquisition. Because ultimately, your experimentation needs to have your commercial function at the tip of the spear, because ultimately, given the pace of technological change at the moment, if you are not ahead or up with that technological change, your acquisition system will always be off the mark. And how we do that with allies is pretty fundamental. And we should also remember, perhaps in a sense the most important point about integration, that the military instrument is just one instrument of statecraft. And how you integrate the other instruments of statecraft to make the military context come to life is fundamental. The last observation and deduction I think I would draw is that much of the geostrategic context that I described is, of course, global. And there are global problems that come from it. And I think one should observe that whilst the JEF is rightly optimised for Northern Europe, it does also, I think, have expeditionary opportunity. And I think we have a sensible principle of flexibility and variable geometry that we can bring to bear on which allies want to play where and under what mantle. And I think there are opportunities. We've seen this, of course, in Afghanistan, where we've operated with Estonia and with Denmark, and one can see other opportunities, I suspect, more broadly, when one thinks about what we might do in Africa, or for that matter in the Caribbean in the future. So in summary, we attained full operating capability, as we described it in 2018, but we should not regard that as our height of ambition. We have to go further, given the context that I've described. We need to think about working together as the first thing we think about. It shouldn't be an add-on to what we do. Secondly, we need to maximise the opportunities to deploy together, to train and exercise together, to develop our doctrine together, and to experiment together, and hopefully, in due course, to acquire things together. We have to improve our readiness, and that's about speed of recognition, speed of decision-making, and speed of assembly. And that's why exercising is so important, and that's why it's important that we put our policy level and our ministers under the cosh for understanding the sort of difficult political judgments they may have to make in the strategic context I've described. And last, we need to think about resilience. We've learned a lot from the COVID experience. Stockpiles, I think, will no longer be a dirty word, and resilience will be something to be proud of. And that is something that we ought to be thinking about doing together. So to my mind, the JEF offers a massive opportunity for a club of like-minded countries to be able to get their mind round the very challenging and complex issues that the next 20 years are going to confront us with. Elisabeth, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General, and I'd like to welcome our four other guests now. And I thank you very much for that endorsement of shared strategic reserves. I think that's something that we'll see. And America may even decide that it's interested too, considering that half the drivers on the East Coast are struggling to find gasoline because of a cyber attack that then was exacerbated by people's panic. So I'd like to bring in the other speakers. Let's see if we can get them in. But while we're waiting for that to happen, there they are. Welcome, Minister Hultqvist from Sweden, Lieutenant General Martin Herem from Estonia, Congressman Mike Turner, possibly calling in from Ohio, otherwise from Washington,
Elisabeth, I
and
don't hear
Minister
you.
Fabrics from Latvia. So if I can start with a question that any or either of you can pick up. It is General Carter outlined the threats below the threshold of armed conflict, and how the JEF in particular can respond to that. And you're doing a tabletop exercise very shortly, ministerial tabletop exercise. But the question is, how do we establish a protocol to achieve the swiftness that General Cernik outlined, so that we don't have to wait for
There is no sound.
for 10 Minister Fabrics, we can hear you. If you can mute yourself. How do we achieve that swiftness? So maybe if we start with you, Minister Hultqvist. And by the way, today is Ascension Day, which is a public holiday in Sweden. So we're particularly grateful to Minister Hultqvist for taking the time off and demonstrating his commitment to the JEF. I think this demonstrates his commitment to the JEF. So Minister Hultqvist, how there is some noise here. I think it may possibly come from, I don't know where it comes from. Anyway, if we can start with that, how to achieve that swiftness, and maybe if we start with you, General Carter, while we sort out somebody's audio problems.
Yes, I mean, I think that's where my point about exercising is so important, because I think the challenge with swiftness is it depends upon the scenario that's playing out. And I genuinely believe we need to understand what the policy parameters are likely to be for how we can operate as a JEF. Now, on top of that, of course, it comes down to military readiness and military preparedness, as I described. But the bottom line is that so much of our ability to act will come down to having the political context firmly in place to enable that to occur. And I think the challenge we've all got is to return to the sort of muscles that we had in the Cold War, which meant that we had that close connection with the policy level, and the policy level and ministers inside that were better able to make the judgments they need to make these days. So I think it's about us being professional in the way that we advise the policy level and then exercising it effectively to bring some of this stuff out.
If I can turn next to Minister Hultqvist. Now, Sweden is not a member of NATO, but the JEF does many things that NATO doesn't do. So how can, from your perspective, the JEF be best put to operational use in crises of different kinds? And is it better suited to certain crises than other crises?
Dear friends, and thank you for this important question. What Sweden are involved in just now, together with other countries in our part of Europe, is to try to build a security network that make the threshold for any conflict higher, and also together with others deter, so it not will be any conflict. And JEF is one tool in this work. We have a bilateral agreement with Finland, where we have operational planning beyond peace. We have also a very long-going agreement with Norway and Finland up in the North Calotte, how to handle, develop a mechanism for handling crisis situation. And we are involved in many exercises in our neighborhood. And we also have a decision now in our parliament how to coordinate planning with Norway, Denmark, UK, United States, and NATO. So we try to be a part that build actively a security network. And I think it's very attractive to be a member of Joint Expeditionary Force, because I think we can have an easy decision-making process if something happened. So it needs some sort of force that can do something immediately. That's one argument for it. And we can also, in our strategy, use this Joint Expeditionary Force in a regional context. And I think it's also very important that United Kingdom is directly involved in our part of Europe and have a real interest for Scandinavia. And I see also that as a part of a strategy to involve the United States, because Joint Expeditionary Force can operate together with the United States, with Canada, and also with other interests if we decide that in a real situation. But the most attractive thing with this formation is that we can make the decisions easy and we can organize something in a very speedy reaction. And it's also a group that are very flexible, that we don't need any consensus around 10 countries. If there is 4 or 5 or 3 or what it is, we can do that. We can do the operation together. So for me, this is a group that can be used in some sort of security in the security environment in our part of Europe, and I see it as complementary to NATO and to the other cooperations we have on a bilateral and multilateral level. So I am very glad that Sweden are a member of Joint Expeditionary Force, and I see that we have also possibility to develop this group a lot in the future. And the meeting with the ministers in Helsinki in the end of June is very important meeting about this tabletop exercise, but also discuss how to develop this cooperation so we can use it more and more in the future. So from a Swedish perspective, we want a stronger expeditionary force, and we see that we are a process to develop. That's my view. Thank you.
A stronger joint expeditionary force, I think that's quite the endorsement of the concept. If I can see if Minister Pabriks can hear us now and it's able to come in. Okay, so then I'll ask you as the other defense minister on the panel, I'll ask you the same question. Do you see the JEF as playing a role in certain kinds of crises, and how can it best be put, how can it be put to best use? Are there certain crises for which it's more suited than for others?
Thank you. Sorry for appearances without sound before. Nice to see you, colleagues. And in many ways, I can subscribe to that what already before us Nick Carter was mentioning. Why we like JEF? First of all, we are EU and NATO border country, and that means that we cannot be too picky. We need to collaborate with all the neighbors which are available and which would like to increase security in our region, in Europe, and also support our transatlantic ties. I think that JEF, from that perspective, is a great idea, addition to NATO, and also to, I would say, also to European Union in some sense, even if European Union is basically playing not a very big role in providing hard security or also hybrid security at this moment. But what is good? First, the engagement of United Kingdom in the region, it's very important. And I think we can give also back to United Kingdom, because United Kingdom belongs to Northern Europe, to our region in many ways. So our security concerns are a little bit of similarities. Secondly, under the JEF umbrella, we can meet with our closest and dearest neighbors, such countries as Finland and Sweden, which are not NATO members, but who would be affected in any case if anything in the region would happen. So that gives us additional opportunity to train with them together, to exercise, to exchange with views, and it also gives us a chance to understand each other better. I also think that there is a lot of issues which we could advance in future, starting with Helsinki and afterwards, where I will go with great pleasure. I think we have to work very much on different type of experiments as far as security, because as Mr. Carter mentioned before, those challenges are very multiple. And our adversaries, either it be China or it would be Russia or somebody else, they very smartly use it, while we are still, in my personal view, sometimes we are living in a previous thinking that life is easy and it's beautiful, and we can speak, of course, about value systems and etc., but we can't implement our value systems globally or in the world if we have no any more backup, neither economic power nor also military power. That's the reality of the life. And for us here in the Baltic region, this is highly important because we need our allies to be strong. We need Europe to be strong. We need transatlantic alliance to be strong. So I also would like to suggest a part of, for instance, improving our decision making, understanding how the decision should be made, how we can smoothly move if some crises are happening. I also would encourage more cooperation on such issues as cyber, on such issues as strategic communication, including information issues, because this is a part of a modern threat system which we are facing daily. And yes, well, we also would like, of course, to see that nations which are involved in JEF or would like to be involved in JEF are taking these things seriously, because, you know, we don't need, this is not an accusation to anybody, just not to misunderstand me, but we don't need, in this case, just participation on paper or just participation on some kind of, notes that, yes, we are there. We need practical cooperation, and that's very important. And I also very much hope that, for instance, such our ally as United States will see JEF as with increasing importance. And yes, as my friend Peter told, expeditionary force, that's interesting thing. We should investigate that. And once we are involved in JEF or in any other organization or institution which provides more security, we will always, from the Latvian side, we will always look for all the opportunities, how we can increase this cooperation. So I'll be happy to answer more questions if needed during our course of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and I'm glad we can hear you now. I'd like to turn to General Herem, who commands the armed forces of one of NATO's smaller member states, but one of its most active ones, and also a very active JEF member state. And it sort of brings me to the question of it's often said Europe should do more for its own security. But what if countries already do a great deal within their armed forces, within NATO, and now within JEF? It's still the same armed forces. How can you increase the output, as it were, to get even more out of them?
Thank you, Elisabeth. And good evening, everybody. I do not think that JEF is something more than we already have. However, I see the JEF faster than any other current solution, military solution, among my allies. It's faster by troops available, but also by decision making, because there is no need to find consensus among 30, for example, countries. There may be just 2 of them, and here they are. Secondly, it's more focused, which gives us a better opportunity to practice it, or actually to exercise it, but also to prepare it. Let's talk about the communication, the procedures. Who knows anything about international unit can understand how complex is communication, but also the military culture. And finally, I think the flexibility is also very important. So when we talk to do more, then I would say it's more on the right time, on the right place. But also, as I see it, the JEF for Estonia, I think also for Latvia, Lithuania, could be some kind of insurance at the moment when we have a crisis. Then having a JEF behind us, let's say as a navy, with a navy capability on the sea, that gives us a possibility to focus to our current problem, whatever part of hybrid warfare. And today, I am not sure that NATO can be so fast. Secondly, with all capabilities available in these countries, it could be also a reinforcement. So again, and all this, I do not see it competing in NATO. I think it's if it's connected to NATO plans, and it is in NATO command and control chain, then it's just adding the value. So I think, but definitely, the JEF gives us a much better understanding what we have to do more, especially for Estonia. And I think when US talks about to do more, then we actually should invest more. But with JEF, we do definitely better with resources what we have. Thank you.
Thank you. And something that I think has emerged this morning and this afternoon, respectively, is that the JEF is a phenomenal resource in the gray zone or below the threshold of armed conflict, because that's where NATO really doesn't have a lot of capabilities, and possibly not even agreement among its member states as to what sort of response is necessary or signaling is necessary, whereas the JEF, being an alliance of 10 very like-minded countries, may have that capability. So with that, I'd like to turn to you, Congressman Turner. You are not just a member of the US Congress and Armed Services Committee, but also a long-standing and highly committed member to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So from your perspective, what is the current benefit of the JEF to its member states and more widely to the wider Western Alliance?
Sure. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much, and I think the American Enterprise Institute. So, NATO, as its core, is about defending freedom and defending the sovereignty of its member nations and deterrence, making certain that there's not a conflict, and then being able to respond fully if conflict should arise, and being able to protect all of the member states and the citizens that are within them, within NATO. As you know, the JEF arose out of NATO, out of a Wales conference in a discussion. And under NATO, there are a number of bilateral and unilateral arrangements and agreements, all of which augment and support the defense relationships of the nations that are part of NATO. The JEF is an excellent example of that, and it is complementary to and expands the capabilities of NATO. What we've heard here today is, of course, it has NATO members and non-NATO members, but its goals of integration, interoperability, and the importance of rapid. That is so incredibly important, not just in administration, deciding when to go and move, but also in military capabilities itself. So on the deterrent side, the JEF has a huge impact because those who are adversaries, Russia for one, in looking to the Baltic, Scandinavian area, the UK, knows that it can't just pick off member states alone, nor can it bully member states alone. That it in fact not only has NATO as a backstop, but it has JEF as the ability for rapid deployment and rapid support. When you look at the military assets, the number of nations that are in the JEF, the number of F-35s, the number of troops, the overall capability, the agility of those troops, what is resident in the navies of each of those countries, you have the ability of being able to deploy quickly, to move assets around, to show strength, and to show to Russia that they will face more than just the nation that they may be threatening. Another aspect of this, which is so important that General Carter was reflecting on, and that is the concept of exercises. Because each nation under its own has exercises, has training, but the ability to train together, especially with non-NATO nations, is incredibly important as it marries itself to larger NATO operations. And of course, that information data is integrated and cooperating with NATO so that NATO gets the information of the success and capabilities of the exercises, but also shares down into the JEF training and exercise opportunities to ensure interoperability. So this is a great collection of a regional defense within inside of the larger NATO defense.
Thank you, Congressman. If I could return to you, General Carter, you mentioned, highlighted the situation in South China Sea when China built artificial islands that started with almost nothing, and surrounding countries in the US said, well, it's not a good time to intervene because it's not a major deal. And then they built a bit more, and then it was still seen as well, maybe that was just a small thing. And then, as we know, we are now at a fait accompli, where they have those islands, because at no point did anybody decide that or conclude that it was the right time to intervene or to signal that a red line was to be crossed, that there would be a red line, and that would be responsive if it was crossed. And you also brought up Svalbard in a similar setting. So if you can give us an idea, what could the JEF do if Russia decided to engage in activities on Svalbard that were clearly not beneficial to Svalbard nor Norway, which administers Svalbard, nor to the region, but were short of an armed attack? And we have seen some of it when, for example, a Russian politician decided to land on Svalbard and essentially cause a bit of provocation, but nobody could really do anything about it. So, what in a situation like that would the JEF be able to do, and what would be the speed of response?
I'm assuming that the political will was in place. I mean, the answer is that I think we need to recognise that the decisive phase in what we're up against in the context that I described in my opening remarks is, of course, the phase before you get to crisis. And therefore, the first and most important thing is that our intelligence and warning has got to be very well connected together, so that we get some indication of where there might be the potential for a fait accompli strategy to start happening. So I think how we are connected in terms of I and W, as us military professionals like to refer to it as, is absolutely fundamental. The second thing I think is this point about perhaps being more assertive in terms of our routine posture. And I think where there are areas where we're nervous and we perhaps have the potential for vulnerabilities or indeed for vacuums, our presence there on a routine and regular basis will act very much as a deterrent. So I think there's a question about all of that, which I think falls out of some of the scenarios that we might play through when we think about exercising some of this stuff. Then I think there is obviously a question about capabilities. And I think that, we should be thinking pretty hard about the sorts of capabilities that we might need to improve our ability to be able to operate sub-threshold, and to make sure that we are genuinely revealing the extent to which we're prepared to deter that sort of fait accompli behaviour. And then, of course, it's all got to be messaged. And there again, I think it's about us having a commonality of perspective and the political will to be assertive in the way that we message this. And that, I think, we've got two ministers around the table this afternoon. I think they'd have a strong opinion about what the political appetite for that might be. Now, I've been quite careful in my use of language during the course of this afternoon because some people are closer to this than I am in terms of their borders. But the answer is this is where the JEF has an opportunity, I think, to work this through and to use the words that have been used by Martin and by others, to get some consensus. The point about being focused and, of course, the point about being flexible. We've got opportunities here. And that's why, at the end of the day, we assembled the JEF, because we recognised that it was through that sort of behaviour and partnership that we might be able to get ahead of what's occurred in the South China Sea, where there are not obvious alliances to be able to deal with the sort of challenge that, of course, the South China Sea has delivered. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's another reminder of exactly that behavior at the moment, which is that China is building villages in Bhutan. And what is Bhutan going to do about it? It's just a village here and there, but it is border alteration nonetheless. Since you have several of you have mentioned exercises, I feel the need to bring in here Minister Hultqvist, because Sweden has just concluded its first total defense exercise since 1987, and it is a concept that people thought was no longer useful, and so it was discontinued after the end of the Cold War. And but now it's back under Minister Hultqvist's leadership, and what the total defense exercise does, as it says on the tin, is involves all parts of society, the armed forces, all levels of government, a bit of the private sector. So, Minister, I'm not asking you here to set policy for all the other JEF member states, but do you think there is anything other JEF member states can learn from the lessons you have learned from that first total defense exercise in involving other parts of the government and also civil society in scenarios short of war or short of armed conflict. Over.
And first of all, I would like to say that we have all experiences that we can learn from each other. And I think it's a very high level of interest from every country to see what's happened around in our neighborhood, so we can share information and we can also share experience and knowledge. And because of that, we also want to exercise with other countries. The corona pandemic situation is very bad because we have to cancel a lot of exercises or only doing them in a national format. But we have started to have exercises with Army, Navy and the Air Force together. We have now huge exercises on a brigade level. And we also have had exercises on a brigade level with other countries, example, Finland, Norway, Sweden, United States, United Kingdom, and trying to do on the Army side a lot of things together with others. On the Air Force side, we have, for example, now in the next big exercise is Arctic Challenge exercise with aircraft from around 10 countries. And I think that representatives from United States have already arrived to Sweden. So that's another example. And on the Navy side, we have, for example, belt tops and other exercises. So we try to exercise more and more to build interoperability together, because interoperability at the level of skills is the only thing that are valid, real valid, if something happens and if we will have a real crisis. And what I think can be interesting from a Joint Expeditionary Force perspective is to develop our capability to analyze intelligence. If we are going to make fast decisions and react in a speedy way, we also must have the sensitivity to react on the intelligence in the right way. We are, from our perspective, not trying to follow very closely what's really happening in Ukraine and in Crimea, and about who will leave now the theater and what sort of material stays there, and what is the Russian plan, for example, Belarus in the future. How will they try to work to have a higher level of influence in this area? And to handle intelligence is the key factor if we are going to be effective in a real situation. And if that can also be connected to organize some countries to doing something immediately, I think that can be a way to push back immediately also. It's a little bit dangerous for us, I think, to speculate what will we do if something happens in Svalbard. I think there is an interest to do things. I know that the Russian politicians have been there. I know also that they try to deteriorate the agreements around Svalbard, and I follow very closely what they are dealing with in the Arctic region with this Northeast Passage and all these sort of activities they have in the North Atlantic with submarines and the activities they have close to Great Britain's territorial water and all these things. And but to speculate about we will exactly do this thing, I think we cannot do that in public forums. But it's very important also to underscore the need of these TTX, these tabletop exercises on the political level, so the politicians really understand and know what this is about. So we can have the same view on the military side and the political side. So we work in the same direction. I think that is very, very important, because if something happened, we must have a high level of knowledge and react in the correct way. So I think that this, yes, is a very important cooperation that can have a real value if something happened. And I must also underscore what others have said. A very fast reaction from Jeff can also make the position for NATO much better in the next step.
That's true alliance-minded thinking. And if I can turn to you then, General Heron, what would that look like in real terms? The JEF first, and then NATO possibly, because the JEF has more ability to act below the threshold of an armed conflict. I'm not asking you again to set policy. I think we'll leave that to Minister Pabriks shortly. But if you can explain as things stand, what the JEF might be able to do.
Yes, thank you. But first, about the total defense. The Estonia has learned from example of Sweden and Finland at decades how to prepare the total defense. And I must say that this pandemic tested us. And today I may say that there is a long way to go. So just to say where we actually can exercise the total defense. So, but about JEF, the developments which are running right now in the NATO, which are talking about the framework nation concept and the regional approach, I think they gave very, very good basis for the JEF. When JEF is really focused to the military regions, and one of them is actually my area, Baltic Sea, then like I said previously, of course, there are a lot of things to do. But I think JEF as a part of NATO, even we have Sweden and Finland among us, it still should be part of NATO plan. And here I must say that the first react, of course, we, nations, we must take. And I see that the second step or reinforcement could be a JEF, but it must be very well coordinated with the NATO plans. So, and then of course later we have all 30 nations with all capabilities and power. But I'm quite sure that if we do at the very beginning, doesn't matter how it looks like in Eastern Ukraine or Southern Ukraine in Crimea or something worse, we must do first steps. And if we are at least a little bit reinforced or insurance, then we may, if not avoid, then at least push forward the possible aggression or to stop aggression. Thank you.
And to those listening who are not from JEF member states, which I know are a great many, including many Americans, this is, I think, this demonstrates the utility of the JEF, that it can get involved both in messaging and signaling, deterrence signaling, but also in situations before there would be an opportunity for NATO to act at all. I'd like to bring in General Sir Nick very briefly, and also to remind you all to submit your questions so that we get as many of them answered as possible. So, General, can you, if you could come in on the points that General Heron just made about the JEF as the first step? How do you see it that way as well, and how would it work? What exactly would JEF chiefs of defense do in a crisis situation?
I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that NATO at the moment is developing its own way of operating. We've got a new NATO military strategy. We've got two concepts that flow from that. One called DDA, which is the defence and deterrence of the Euro-Atlantic region. We've got a new NATO warfighting capstone concept that fell out of that as well. And of course, we're beginning to have some strategic plans that underpin all of that. So I think that, it is a work in progress. I think the point I would make, which probably emphasises so much of what's been already said around the table, is the advantage that we've got, I think, is that we are able to have conversations about our particular region. And of course, we have very much shared common interests in that region. As you look at how NATO is thinking, there is a tension between those who are oriented towards the east and those who are perhaps oriented towards the south. And that, of course, means that consensus is difficult, but it also means that it's quite difficult to get anything to occur in that period before crisis and then into conflict. So I think we have got that great advantage of being focused on a particular region. So I think that what we will almost certainly do at chiefly level is to work out how we can play as a group into the evolution of NATO's operational plans and their regional plans. Because if you can build concepts of operations, force structures, capabilities, plans in more detail that perhaps sweep up the way in which we think together, that's got to be good news. But in doing so, we've got to be conscious, of course, that 2 of our number are not members of NATO. So how that plays into the continuum from competition through crisis to conflict has to be taken thoughtfully, I would suggest. So I think I absolutely concur with what Martin is saying. And sorry, I should have said, Martin, when you popped up, congratulations on your 3rd star. It's good to see that happening. But I think, I absolutely concur with what he's saying. But I just think we have to be sensitive to people's national agendas in how this plays into it. But I'm in absolutely no doubt that putting that to one side, as we exercise in the way that Minister Hultqvist described, we should be in no doubt that we'll flush all this stuff through. So there is definitely opportunity for the JEF to lead the way in all sorts of ways, subject to all of our members wanting to play like that.
Thank you. And if I can bring in Minister Pabriks and then Congressman Turner, there is, well, first of all, there's a need to signal what the JEF is able and willing to do. And second of all, I think there's a need to signal what the JEF's armed forces are able to do with the rest of society. And if I can start with you, Minister Pabriks, Latvia has in the past couple of years been pursuing something similar to total defense, which you call comprehensive defense. And how does that link in with JEF, and are there any lessons learned from your relatively recent total defense initiatives that other JEF member states can learn from?
Well, if I start with the national level and with our comprehensive defense system, basically, I see this as a total defense because we very much work with civil society at this moment, and we took the best examples of number of countries, not only from our neighboring countries like Finland and Sweden, but also from further regions away. And then we added our own ideas and necessities because we have to adapt this comprehensive or total defense system to our own needs. And I think that this is the future for most of countries in our region, this comprehensive defense system, because our societies need to regain resilience and need to think also in terms of security, also in their daily lives, and particularly if we are countries with limited number of people, with limited resources. And okay, every country has limited resources, but particularly if you are a small country. So our duty is to survive, and our duty is to make our price for the reason of deterrence, for the goal of deterrence, as high as possible. And then hope for logical thinking and say rational thinking also from the side of opponents. In our case, we introduced now military and defense studies in our gymnasiums, which means for youngsters starting with an age 16 or 17 for 2 years, 1 day per month during schools. And then we have voluntary camps for those who would like to get additional deeper knowledge And this is not just a military knowledge, of course. There is questions about society homogeneity, values. There are also information on different other types of crises, civilian crisis. There is information also on cybersecurity and fake news, etc. So we would like our youngsters to be much better prepared. Now, I can go in depth about this if somebody has an interest, but if I go still back to Jeff's role, I really think that it's very important to clarify the procedures, how Jeff could act along and with NATO together. And of course, this is a little bit more sensitive issue since there are two members which are not the NATO members. But at the same time, these members are crucial for the regional security and regional defense. So I would say that along with already mentioned items where we can explore our cooperation and information exchange and decision making, I would here probably highlight the issue of maritime security, because, for instance, Finland and Sweden both are very close to the Baltic countries, and in many ways their attitude in the early moments of crisis or in the times when crisis might arise, their attitude and activities on the sea might determine very much for us and for the security of whole region. So I think that I would wish, for instance, a much deeper integration and cooperation between countries like a part of Britain, between countries like Sweden and Finland from one side, and Baltic states from another side. I would think that is very important.
Thank you, Minister. Now, I hate to bring in this subject because it feels like then it suggests that Europe should only respond to what America says, but it has the case has been made, the argument has been made for many years now that Europe should do more for its own security, and the JEF is somebody, meaning 10 countries, doing more for their own security. Congressman Turner, is this positive from a U.S. point of view, from a U.S. perspective? And we should also point out that you represent a district with a heavy military touch. Is this doing something? Is it what America likes to see? Would America like to see something different? And it's not that America should sit as the judge over European efforts, but nevertheless, I think it stands to reason that an American perspective on whether this is a useful initiative and a useful path possibly for other countries to pursue in their regions. So over to you, Congressman.
Well, Elisabeth, thank you very much, and thank you for couching it in those terms. And thank you for including me in this discussion about the JEF. And you are absolutely right. First off, thank you for the reference to my district. As you know, I hail from Dayton, Ohio, the site of the Dayton Peace Accords, where Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is located, and 32,000 people work inside the fence, 20,000 people outside the fence, focused on national security. So you're right. Both my district and my work in Washington are focused on national security, serving on both the Intelligence Committee and the Armed Services Committee. One of the things I think is very, very important here, as we look to the JEF, and the General Carter was making this context, is that when you look at regional threats or regional collective security, with respect to certainly the JEF, Russia plays an enormous role here, and Russia is an existential threat both to NATO and individually to each of the NATO members and even the non-NATO members who are members of JEF. And we see that in their threatening posture, their Arctic exercises that they've just concluded, the troops that they amassed on the border of Ukraine, of course, their entrance into Georgia and the occupation of Crimea. What we're seeing is a state that not only is a bully, each of the members of JEF and NATO members and the United States routinely report attempts by the Russian military to enter our airspace, our naval space that requires response. Their exercises are directed toward NATO members, both individually and collectively, and certainly their immediate neighbors. And that's incredibly important because in the JEF, even though you have non-NATO members and NATO members, you don't have any of the members who are unilaterally are conducting exercises as if they're going to invade their neighbors or as if they're going to defend from invasion to their neighbors. So the context of Russia's behavior in the manner in which it operates to its neighbors, it operates its military, trains its military, lets us know the importance of Jeff and the importance of NATO, because its military focus is as an adversary to both its neighbors and to NATO members. Now, what's interesting also is this happens within the context of a massive investment by Russia into its military, both in exercises and in capabilities that it never had before. Its modernization of its nuclear weapons are unlike anything we have ever seen. They're fielding new weapons that have never been fielded by a country before. ICBMs with hypersonics. They are testing Skyfall, a nuclear-powered cruise missile that can orbit the Earth. Poseidon, that would be an unmanned nuclear weapon that would go under the water and pop up to coastal cities for their destruction. And of course, what we saw in the Arctic exercises with their submarines with nuclear weapons capabilities breaking through the ice and showing their threatening posture. All of these things, I think, make the JEF that much more important, because each of the individual nations, both the NATO members and non-NATO members of the JEF, are operating within the context of a aggressive, bullying, and truly threatening Russia. So the ability of the JEF to respond rapidly, the ability of NATO to collectively have that deterrence, is so important within the context of who the adversary, the main adversary in the region is. And of course, from the United States perspective, that's incredibly important. That Europe have the ability to defend itself, that the neighbors have the ability to defend themselves. And NATO is an umbrella, and the United States is, of course, the strongest member of that umbrella. But whenever there would be conflict, there's going to be contest and conflict in the ability to move, the ability to forward take troops and assets. So the extent to which NATO members and non-NATO members in those areas can defend, can collectively deter, enhances all of our security, and certainly is viewed very, very favorably by the United States.
Thank you, Congressman. I want to bring in both General Carter and Minister Hultqvist on the question that came up previously, which is the geographical reach of where the JEF could get involved. And somebody asked whether the JEF is limited to its member states' geographical area and more generally the high north and the Arctic, or whether it could get involved elsewhere. I know there aren't any restrictions on where it could get involved, but practically, could it deploy? Could it become active in other parts of the world in support of keeping the homeland safe? So maybe if we start with you, General Carter, from an operational point of view, would that be possible?
Yes, is the straight answer. It's always been our expectation that whilst it's optimised for the northern region of Europe, it could be used in an expeditionary context wherever our national interests coincided outside the Euro-Atlantic area. And in terms of our operational capability, we've demonstrated that. As I said in my opening remarks, we've always operated very closely with Denmark and Estonia in the context of the Afghan campaign. And indeed, we've helped Estonia in what it's doing in Africa at the moment, in the Sahel. And the answer is that we can do these things. It's the flexibility of the JEF is, of course, it's if your national interest coincides. So we believe in this principle of variable geometry in relation to national interest. I suspect we will do things and continue to do things with the Dutch in the Caribbean. We've done that during the hurricane season, and we've also done it in terms of some of the security challenges that there are in the Caribbean. So the answer is it's all possible. The beauty is that we've got an instinctive sense of interoperability, and therefore an instinctive sense of being able to do things together. And that, to my mind, is one of its additional advantages.
Indeed. And if I can bring in you, Minister Hultqvist, I know we only have 5 minutes left, and so I'm not asking you to limit your no doubt fantastic answer, but if you could speak quickly.
In Operation Takuba in Mali together with France and other countries. And the reason behind that is to fight terrorism, religious extremism, trafficking, drug smuggling, and these sort of things, and to hindering that we will have any terrorism in Europe. So that is the reason. And if we see that sort of operation in a JEF context, it can be a national security interest to be involved from Swedish side. But our main perspective is Scandinavia, Baltic Sea region, high north, North Atlantic, and that's geographical area. But I see whole picture, and I think it's very good that JEF is a flexible organization.
General Heappey, if I can put you in the hot seat, and congratulations as well on your third star. The JEF began as an initiative or an idea among some of its member states based on their experience in Afghanistan. And hypothetically speaking, although it may not be so hypothetical, if there were to be another conflict where a number of countries, Western countries, were to deploy, do you see, would the JEF have the capability to deploy together to a conflict such as Afghanistan?
Yeah, for sure. I think would JEF as the force decide to go somewhere, Estonia would follow. However, as a small nation, we depend on probably on others to be deployed. But over there, I'm quite sure that we are ready. However, with the focusing today to some region, of course, we take a risk. But at the same time, with this focus, we are much better in case we have to act to this region. Other way, to be ready 660 degrees, every time, everywhere, you are not ready for anything finally, I think. But if you ask me, the Estonian opinion, for sure, and it's able.
Minister Pavlik, 60 seconds. Is Latvia ready?
Well, Latvia is ready to support each and every partner which is honest partner and is supporting us as well.
Spoken as a true ally, and if that leaves the final word in a minute to you, Congressman Turner. How would you like, or how, from a U.S. perspective, do you think these sort of initiatives should develop? Should they be strengthened within the groups that do exist? Should the JEF become stronger and do even more, or should there be more somewhat informal groupings like it?
I think there should be more. And I think also one thing that this will illuminate for us is the needs that we have in regional areas for increased capabilities and the ability for nations, as they work more closely to each other, to specialize in delivering those capabilities. That will shine a light, if you will, on helping us inform how we do future investments, how we do future developments, and how NATO then is a cooperative ally, including the United States.
Thank you very much, and thank you to General Sir Nick Carter, Minister Hultqvist from Sweden, Minister Pavlik from Latvia, Lieutenant General Martin Herem from Estonia, and Congressman Turner from Ohio, representing a district that whose members may benefit from the JEF, because we are all one Western alliance. And I think we may come back to the JEF because it's clearly a group that's developing quickly and that has a lot of cohesion that other groupings of countries could only dream of. So with that, thank you to all the panelists, and thank you all for listening, and thank you for your interest in the JEF. And as I said, we'll see more of the JEF in the near future, I'm sure.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you, everybody.